Everybody, welcome to another Comic Source Comic Boom collaboration. It's the fourth day of Spawnmas, and if you're not familiar with what Spawnmas is, it's the celebration of Spawn. It's the announcement that we are going, in our insanity, in my insanity, we're going to be reading every issue of the main Spawn series in the year 2022. But we thought we'd kick it off a little early, leading up to Christmas, celebrating the birth of Christ, heaven, by talking about hell Spawn,
Yeah.
the Todd Father's greatest creation, Spawn. So in the 12 days leading up to Christmas, Rocky and I are talking about the first 12 issues of Spawn. We have been pleasantly surprised by how well these hold up. They're pretty fantastic. So
Yes.
let me first compliment you, Rocky, on your festive outfit
Yeah.
there. You even
Well,
have the naughty across the
I
Santa
do.
hat.
I could flip it all the way around and be the nice side, but I mean we're reviewing Spawn, so
Oh yeah,
it's got to be naughty, right? I mean, come on.
exactly.
And remember,
Exactly.
and Al Simmons is an atheist. That's the irony that he became basically a spawn, a hell spawn of Malabolgio, the devil. So I mean, it's kind of ironic that an atheist becomes uh, nothing but a soldier of the devil. So it's interesting. Not very holy, but 'tis the season. So let's have some fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring that up. Him being an atheist, because we haven't talked at all about sort of the religious overtones that McFarlane is not shying away from at all. He's basically saying this is how it is. This is heaven. This is hell. Um, all under the guise of this sort of horror comic. And as much as we've talked about the fact that this holds up really well, and especially in terms of pacing, I think a lot of the things that McFarlane got criticized for back in the day, um, comics sort of drifted in that direction and then even further past it. Like people say, there's not enough story in a single issue because the panels are too big and the art is showcased too much. Man, you got a ton of story in these compared to modern comics, where you can read them in 5 minutes. Um,
Yeah.
did these issues of Spawn have as much story as some of the other comics of the time? Maybe not. But again, when you go back and read them in the context of the modern time, I think they hold up really, really well. And then, like I said, the other thing being sort of the religious overtones. But there's definitely a feel of reading Spawn, and I think this is really part of the appeal of Todd McFarlane himself as a creator. When you're a follower of Todd McFarlane, when you follow his work and you read his books and you are part of sort of the McFarlane community, as it were, you're in with the cool kids, right? Like there was a feeling at the time when Spawn was coming out, like everybody was reading it, and if you weren't, you were not with the cool kids. You know what I mean? And so even though maybe it wasn't the best comic, technically at the time in terms of, writing, and McFarlane hadn't written a ton and he was still finding his footing, it had a following and it mattered because you were in with the cool kids, so again, I think this stuff holds up really, really well. What's going to be interesting, there have been some retcons because of lawsuits and that kind of stuff. And we'll get into that when we get to those sort of issues. But I'm curious, and Rocky and I haven't talked about it. We don't know what we're going to do because some of it's been retconned away. So do we read the original? Do we read the replacements where things have been changed? And so we have some decisions to make about that kind of stuff. But yeah, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm sort of continually surprised as we get into these early issues how well this stuff holds up. It's really quite good, and maybe McFarlane should have gotten more credit at the time, or maybe
Well,
retroactively he should be getting credit.
well, we were also talking to further give him credit. We were talking earlier before we started this podcast, this live stream that there was a lot of competition to Spawn in 1992. 1992 is the Image Revolution. And there was also, as we talked about, the death of Superman, Youngblood. I mean, there was Wildcats. There was that Valiant Universe Jim Shooter took off. This was a huge year. This was before This is 4 years before 1996, where there was the comic book glut and the market crashed. I mean, this was arguably one of the biggest years in modern day comic books, and the competition against Spawn was immense, but it still managed to be near the top of the heap. So when you think about all the competition there, it's another. I mean, it makes me realize, as we read this, that no wonder this wasn't as bad as, and not that I remember it as being bad. I remember it as being entertaining then, but I didn't think it would stand up to the test of time as it has rereading it. But it has. And I think it actually stands up better to the test of time. I recently read the Death of Superman a while back, and I actually enjoy this reading Spawn a little bit more. So it's interesting.
Yeah, so the Death of Superman, Superman number 75, came out in January 1993. So if we look at the events leading up to that, they were certainly happening at around the same time that this issue 4 of Spawn that we're going to talk about in detail in a minute. It came out on September 1st, 1992. So if we talk about some other books that came out around that time, Valiant was hitting big. And it wasn't just that Valiant was hitting big. Valiant sort of had an Image to a lesser extent, but Valiant sort of had this independent cred, right? And Wizard magazine, which was also a huge thing, it started in 91, and it immediately became this huge popular thing among comic fans. And if Image was promoting you, or Wizard magazine rather was promoting you, if your comic books were on the Wizard top 10, it was sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And Valiant was all over that top 10. And if you take a Valiant comic of that era and you compare it to a Spawn comic of that era, yes, the Valiant comic's going to have much more meaty story. It's going to have like more realistic art. All the Valiant comics of the time, they had sort of a house style in terms of artwork and coloring, and you recognized it as a Valiant comic. It's much more realistic. To compare that to Spawn with elongated anatomy and really bright colors and giant panels, it was a completely different type of storytelling. So you can see why, despite the fact that if you look at the best-selling or key comics from 1992, Spawn number 1 is second only to Amazing Spider-Man 361, which is the first appearance of Carnage, which obviously that's from the big two, and a lot of you can almost credit Carnage and his success to Todd McFarlane, because Carnage being an offshoot of Venom,
Well,
Amazing
certainly.
Spider-Man being such a bestseller because of what McFarlane did on that title. But yet, you see Spawn on the list, but then you see Harbinger number 1, you see Rise Zero, Eternal Warrior number 4, Exo Man of War number 1, Solar Man of Atom 10, Harbinger Zero Pink, Shadow Man number 1, Ryan number 1. There's all of these Valiant comics that, like I said, Wizard was promoting left and right. So if that's the stuff that's most popular, if that's the stuff that's being touted as the hottest stuff, of course Spawn is not going to compare favorably at the time to those books. Now, I haven't gone back and read a lot of the early Valiant stuff in a long time either. I'm sure it holds up in its own way, but in the context of today's books and the way they're built, I think Spawn didn't get enough credit at the time. And maybe it's just, hindsight 2020. Here we are 300 issues later, Spawn's still around. Where are those Valiant books, right? Like the
Exactly.
whole company went bankrupt, and then they relaunched, and now it sort of feels like they're going away again because their books aren't really that great. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty interesting way to look at things. But again, 1992 was a very interesting time for comics, because not only did you have Image coming out and selling all these books, but you did have Valiant coming out and selling all these books. And it's only a smattering of Marvel and DC. You still had Uncanny X-Men that was in the height of its popularity with the Claremont run. You had Jim Lee's X-Men coming out. Superman was the best-selling title over at DC, like I said, in the lead up to the death of Superman, because all that was rumored. But that's it. Like, in terms of Marvel Comics, you have X-Men and Spider-Man. For DC Comics, it's only Superman on the list. But the majority of the list for key comics in 92 are Valiant comics and Image comics. You have Spawn, you have Wildcat, Alliance, and you have Youngblood, which is kind of low on the list. With Youngblood won at number 50 best-selling book. So a very interesting time. And yeah, I just don't think that Spawn got enough credit at the time because of it was just very different than the other in terms of the aesthetic, in terms of the way the story was structured and how it was art first. It was just different than anything else at the time.
Yeah.
And like I said, the pendulum has swung now to where, comics caught up to where Spawn was, and now modern comics have swung even further, where you don't even get as much story in a modern comic as you do in a Spawn comic from the early 90s.
Yeah. I
And
think
the
the way
art is
that
comparable.
I would phrase it that just to build on what you're saying, that in 1992, Spawn got a lot of attention, but it never got the credit maybe that it deserves. Whereas now, Spawn is getting a lot more credit in, and perhaps, well, it's still getting a lot of attention too, but it's the credit is caught up with the attention. That after all, it is 30 years now. It means the longest running independent title, well deserved. I mean, and it's one of those things where over time, I mean, the best stories, I mean, it's like anything, the most interesting characters will eventually, they will endure, and the most interesting characters will endure through periods of time when even the storytelling might be less than stellar. But they'll endure because there's something about the character that's compelling, and I think we're touching upon that. And you can see the what makes Spawn such an interesting character, and Al Simmons, and the mythology of Spawn in these opening 12 days of Spawnness that we're going to be exploring.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see if it actually does hold up all the way through.
Yeah.
Because yeah, Spawn does get credit for being the longest independent, highest numbered independent comic of all time. But we know there's going to be rough spots, and yeah, it has gotten credit. It got attention when it hit 300, and circulation numbers are up and everything. But will it fall back down as the attention fades? Does it really get the credit it deserves for these early issues? Like who else besides us is going back and reading these issues? Who's discovering Spawn for the first time? I hope that we have some listeners that maybe have never read these early issues, that are being inspired by us talking about them, to go and check them out. Because yeah, I think they're definitely worth revisiting. This comic is 30 years old. It's definitely worth revisiting. So let's talk a little bit in detail about the events of Spawn #4. We at the end of last issue, Violator had gotten to Al Simmons at the end of a really, really bad, terrible day for him, where everything that could go wrong went wrong, and he ripped his heart out, and Al Simmons was like, F you, Violator. I don't need my heart. I'm not even human anymore. And he stands up with a gaping hole in his chest, this green light emanating out of it, saying, yeah, that didn't do anything. Let's try it again, this time with some real damage. And Violator's kind of beside himself. I don't believe it. Who gave you such powers? Humans aren't supposed to be like this. And Violator's like, what? He doesn't need his heart. He's been going around town ripping the heart out of mafia guys, and they've just been falling. But clearly, Spawn is much more than that, much more than human these days, despite the fact he looks like hammered meat, as it were. And yeah, Violator gets kind of pissed off. They start fighting. Spawn using up a lot of his powers, and we get some really great images from McFarlane, some close-ups of Spawn's hands with the talons and the spikes and whatnot. And as Violator kind of discards his heart, I guess for nostalgia's sake, Al Simmons picks it up, puts it back in his chest, heals himself, says that's better. And he says, well, I know your master's the scum that's been screwing with my life too. And decides that he's going to take out all his anger and angst that he's been feeling about this deal that he made with the devil. He knows that he got screwed, shouldn't have done it, and he just blasts away, letting loose with all his power to Violator, blast a hole in him. But just like Spawn can live with a hole in him, so can Violator. They're very much two sides of the same coin in terms of the power they've been granted, and they're both immortal. So they have somewhat of a knockdown, drag out. And eventually, their master, as limbs are torn off, and it's kind of gross when you see Spawn's arm go flying with it looks like a ham hock with the bone sticking right in the middle, and then Daddy shows up And he's like, I gave you guys far too much credit. It's not necessary to mutilate each other. Neither one of you can die. You're jealous of each other. You don't realize you're siblings from the same family. Uh, Basically, stop uh, your fighting because I created both of you, and you're going to be working for me. And the page where Magnolia here sort of describes what his plans are is, oh my god, so many words from McFarlane. This is one of those pages where he's sort of showing his rookie um, skills as a writer. If you scroll down another couple pages, Rocky, I think you'll
Sure.
get to it.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah, I think is it one more after
one
that, uh,
another one.
where he's laughing, where it says, let me see, Jesus in the. Yeah, actually, a little. Yeah, it's 2 pages after where he cuts his arm off is the one that I'm talking about, and maybe it doesn't seem like as much dialogue in the.
Well, he catches something, so it's right here. Then that's where all the
Yeah,
exposition
yeah,
is.
yeah. That's it right there, and it doesn't look like much because it's. Um, I just use giant redactive boxes to do it, but it's word balloon after word balloon after word balloon after word balloon. He's given a speech here, and again, I just think that it shows that McFarlane had something to learn, and Rocky talked about it when we talked about last issue, where so much of it is not necessary. Like we can see this. You don't necessarily have to tell us also. So it makes this issue makes for a bit of a longer read actually in terms of what we're just talking about. But basically, Magnolia basically tells them you got to stop fighting. In a way, you're on the same team. Your job is to basically recruit humans for me because although I have millions of souls in hell, uh, I need millions more for the coming war against heaven or whatnot. So that's the job of the Violator. That's the job of Spawn. And after Malabolgia sort of scolds them, then he just sort of leaves them to uh, their own devices. So they're
Yeah,
healed, and yeah, go ahead, Rocky.
yeah. I was just gonna say. I mean, Malaburga, he really rubs it in. I mean, he spells it out. I mean, it's like Todd McFarlane is is so he really wants to make sure the reader understands exactly why Al Simmons was recruited because and the devil here, Bolgia, he spells it all out. It's because you're a soldier and you already you knew how to kill people and you're perfect for what I want to do, and both you and the Violator, you're my pawns. You're gonna do what I say. The devil treats them both like garbage here. There,
Yeah,
he has absolute contempt for them. He doesn't care. He knows they got to do his bidding. He knows he's got Al Simmons by the balls. There's nothing Al Simmons can do. Al Simmons might have a low sperm count, which he found out to much chagrin last issue because he finds out his ex-wife Wanda or his former wife Wanda as a child with his best friend. He's all depressed, but I mean, there's nothing he can do about it. The more power that Spawn uses, the closer he gets to death, and then when he dies for a second time, whenever that might be, he's going to end up in hell with Malabolgia anyway. I mean, this guy and Malabolgia is rubbing it in, and Malabolgia even makes a point of saying to him, he reminds Al Simmons that even though he says, look, even though you're an atheist, I'm here to tell you that there is a God, and not only is there a God, but you are now the enemy of God. You never believed in a God, but there is a God, and I'm the opposite of a God, and God is now your enemy. And I mean, when you think about what he's saying here, I mean, you really get into the story. It's like, oh my God, yeah, like this is pretty much the worst case scenario for anybody's soul. I mean, it's one thing to lose your soul, but you know, You might even think at some point you're going to have maybe the sympathy or the love of God, but no, your God is now your enemy. You're working for me. It's not just you're not a victim here, Al Simmons. You're my soldier. So this was exciting stuff back in the day, and it's still good stuff. And there's a reason why there's going to be another Spawn movie coming out. I think this is, even though this might sound a little bit tropey after all this time, there's something still. I think there's still some excitement about that kind of plot line.
Yeah, and again, I think the reason it was so criticized at the time is that again, and credit to McFarlane, because I think he does a great job and got too much critical bad press for it. But the mistakes he makes are the mistakes of a writer that just hasn't written a lot, right? Like he's not subtle at all, and we talked about it last issue with kind of the lecherous former colleague of Al Simmons, and here, Malbolgia is not subtle at all either. Like maybe you didn't need to put in all these words, but that's just Todd. And if you've if you've ever had a chance to meet Todd McFarlane and talk to him, you completely understand why he writes this. This is how he talks. Like
Yeah,
the guy is very loquacious, and I
that's
love him
talking.
for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's great to interview because you ask him one question and he'll go on for like half an hour, and it's all good stuff. So, yeah, you kind of see why people were maybe a little critical of it at the time, and yeah, you can still be critical of it now. It's a little expositional, but yeah, again, I think in retrospect, looking back at it, it's really not that bad. And the other thing that I think why it sort of got a bad rap, we're not that far removed from that sort of magical year in comics of 1986 rather, that changed everything, right? Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, all these sort of hey, this is comics are for adults and what have you, and obviously this is not Alan Moore, this is not Frank Miller's Dark Knight. This is a guy who's got incredible skills when it comes to narrative storytelling, and is still sort of figuring it out from a writing standpoint. So I think you cut him a little slack. But in terms of the story, what's funny, what stands out here is after giving this speech, Malbolgia heals Spawn's arm, and then Violator's like very much the jealous little brother. Hey, what about me? How about something for my effort, right? Like, and Malbolgia, like, he scolds him. He's like, you were supposed to be keeping Spawn out of trouble. You've done a terrible job. You're a disgrace to hell. Now, here's a guy who's been around and been serving Malbolgia for much longer than Spawn has, right? And you sort of you definitely get the feeling that it's building animosity between Violator and Spawn. Like they're already both scolded by the dad, and then the dad sort of relents and says, yeah, as terrible as everything is for you, Al Simmons, let me heal you and make sure you're okay or whatever, almost like a little pat on the head. And Violator's over here like, what am I, chopped liver? And when maybe he should have kept his mouth shut, because when Malbolgia finally turns his attention to him, he just gets in more trouble. And he tells him he's an erratic child, and he gets grounded. And what that means is he can't shape change. He changes, Malbolgia changes him back into the sort of the dumpy little fat clown face guy. And he can't change. And he's like, oh my God, I can't change forms. Great. This is just great. It's perfect. I work my butt off to try to do the right thing. And what do I get for it? Squat. I'm short and fat and ugly and blah, blah, blah. And Spawn's just like, dude, shut up. You could really care less. So they part. Go ahead, Rocky.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and the other thing is Malbolgia scolds Violator by saying, look, why'd you kill all those mob bosses? I mean, the Violator, one of the things that was a little bit, it ended up being a bunch of misdirection and almost pointless killing. All the murdering and the killing that Violator had done in the previous, in the previous 3 issues, it really was just for, I guess, it was just for effect. It was just to allow Todd McFarlane to show off his art, because there were just pointless killings. Because as Malbolgia says to Violator, you killed a bunch of paranoid thieves. Paranoid thieves serve no purpose. So killing all these thieves and all these mobsters and they end up in hell. They're just that doesn't help me. So it sort of hints at a larger agenda that Malbolgia, the devil, has. And and it also says something about the Violator. The Violator, we at this point we don't know how long the Violator's been a servant of the devil, but clearly maybe he's gone a little bit wacky. Maybe he's gotten reckless, he's gotten careless, or he's almost more of a blind killer. And it really shows the juxtaposition, the difference between the type of soldier of the devil that Al Simmons will be versus the Violator, because they're very, very different. And again, it's not really subtle. The differences between the Violator as a soldier of the devil versus Al Simmons, it's not subtle. It's very stark, which really, the lack of subtlety really underscores McFarlane's approach to the entire narrative.
Yeah, it really shows that ultimately Violator's not very intelligent. From Maljabolgia's perspective, he needs more soldiers. He needs more souls. He needs more people that can fight for him in the war against heaven. So he needs thieves out there thieving. He needs criminals out there breaking the law. So when they do die, they will go to hell. But if Violator's out there killing all these mafia people, which then turns all the thieves and criminals into paranoid people who don't want to break any laws, well, now you've defeated the purpose of what I'm doing. So yeah, it definitely shows that the Violator's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. So as they part ways, Spawn finds himself a top coat and a hat, and he's kind of wandering around thinking about all this stuff that he's learned, and should he use his powers to help? Should he not? Because he knows every time he uses them, he's that much closer to a final death. And as he's wandering around, lost in his own thoughts, these two kids run up behind him and say, "Look, it's that new superhero, right on!" And Spawn's like shocked, like, "Wait, how did you know?" And then what he doesn't realize is it's actually Savage Dragon. Little tiny bit of a cameo crossover here. Savage Dragon was, on issue 4 about the same time. And they're like, "Look at him, look at how cool he is. It's a dragon dude from Chicago." And they're watching this news report with this hero. And so it wasn't Spawn that they were calling a superhero at all in the first place. And then as the issue winds up, we see that Wanda wakes up in the middle of the night from a dream, and she dreamt that Al was alive and he was different and changed, and he was asking for help. And Terry's trying to soothe her, get her to go back to sleep. And she's like, it felt like he was almost here, but he was sort of trapped, and God, I think I'm going crazy. But it just felt so real, and obviously this is some foreshadowing of what a special relationship Wanda and Al had, despite the fact that she married his best friend because she thought Al was gone for good. But there's still a connection there, and I think McFarlane's hinting at the fact that subtly or subconsciously she's still aware of it. So like I said, a bit of foreshadowing. So again, this issue didn't move the narrative forward as much as issue 3 did, but it certainly gave us a lot more context of the relationship between Violator and Spawn. And the biggest thing is it introduced Maglabolgia in a really good way, in terms of we kind of understand that he's using Spawn, he's using Violator, but in the long run, he doesn't really give a crap about either one of them. He only cares about himself, and he has the power to sort of back that up. And it helps solidify the fact that, yes, the comic is called Spawn, and so, he is the POV character and the character we're supposed to identify with and root for. But after you read this, you really want to root for him, based on all the crap that he got put through last issue. And then you see how much he's manipulated and been trapped by Maglabolgia. Yeah, a good issue.
Yeah,
and what solid issue.
And what underscores the fun of Spawn is the fact that you could actually he has a cool job. So even though his soul is cursed, the fact that he's basically working for the devil, the great thing about the entire plot thing is that Spawn himself is basically recruited by the devil to find other evil souls to basically send to him. And that's exactly what Spawn can do. So Spawn can actually kill greater evils, but in service of the devil, as opposed to in service of God. So even as an enemy of God, as Malabrosia says, Spawn can still serve a greater good by protecting the innocent. That's the irony of it. That's what I like about the premise, is that the devil wants all these evil souls for his army, but at the same time, Spawn eliminating the really bad guys is actually a bad thing. Even the Violator, what the Violator did, killed a bunch of the mobsters. Well, who's going to lose sleep over mobsters? In fact, even the news broadcasters, the CNN, the newscasters in the narrative itself, one of the newscasters, I think the one on the CNN, talked about how, who cares if all these mobsters are dead? Good riddance to all of them. So the irony is that even though he's working for the devil, he's actually serving arguably a greater good for our society. But at the same time, by sending these more evil serial killers and mobsters to hell, he's building up the army of Malebolgia, which is going to cause a future problem eventually when all hell breaks loose. Assuming that's some of the things that's the shadows in the background as you're reading this. What's the devil's end game here? So I mean, like I said, it was a really good concept, and people forget that at the time this wasn't exactly tropey in 1992. This was actually well received and beautifully drawn.
Yeah, the only thing I'll correct you on is because I agree with you. It wasn't the CNN, because CNN always was sort of the left leaning, maybe a little bit straight narrative. It was the kind of chubby, bald white guy that was on. And if you notice, he's always constantly changing channels. He's getting a new job on another local station, probably because he stuck his foot in his mouth and cost him too much money in a lawsuit. He kind of represents more of the right wing sort of perspective, and he's the one that's always like, why are you investigating, trying to find out who the serial killer is that's killing these mafia people? Good riddance. Like, I'm happy for them to be gone.
I think this is the first issue where this is because this is the fourth issue that we're reviewing now. I think every one of the first three issues had the news broadcasters on there, at least on one page. This is the first time where we don't have any.
Yep. Yeah, I imagine McFarlane might have run out of room with that big battle between Violator and Spawn. So, So again, a solid issue. I keep going back. I wish I could remember better, what the criticisms were back then, because again, it was selling well. And there was definitely a subsection of comic fans that absolutely loved it, and it was more almost like of the academic side of comics that were sort of turning their nose up at Spawn. But in terms of commercially, it was doing really well, much like Valiant. Image was promoted heavily by Wizard Magazine, not to the extent Valiant was. You almost think that Jim Shooter must have had pictures of somebody blackmailing people based on how much Wizard just fell in love with Valiant. But
well, it's funny. I remember in the early 90s, I was really into the Punisher as well. And because 1992 was also the early years when Frank Castle was coming out. I think I just remember collecting Punisher at the time. And, the idea of vigilante justice, death wish, all that stuff. There's a strong vigilante element to this of basically a spawn of Satan being the one who's better suited to, protect the innocent against scum and serial killers than somebody who's actually an agent of the devil himself. And I think that was part of the attraction here. That's why I remember loving the first 12. I know what's coming up because I remember loving the first 6 or 7 issues. And we're going to be coming up on we're going to be talking about a particular bad guy that the Spawn is going to be taking out. Something to do with ice cream. And, we'll talk about that on another day of Spawnness. But, I remember quite loving this. And I remember getting out of it around issue 12. And it's funny, like when I did a quick Wikipedia check, I believe the sales started to stagnate a little bit around in the early 20s on Spawn, and it might be that the formula sort of wore off fairly quickly after that, but there's no denying that the early issues definitely seem to heat up the sales charts.
Well, I think one thing that we can't neglect to mention, and I did mention it before on a previous 12 Days of Spawnmas, is we're going to cover the first 12 issues here, which would be a year's worth of comics, but it took almost 2 years for those to come out. So in terms of it stagnating and whatnot, a lot of it was just losing momentum because it was just late, and people, that wasn't as big of a thing. Like now when things are late, even from the big two, you I'm not saying you expect it, but you sort of take it with a grain of salt, and it's not that big of a thing, right? Back then, you did not have late comics from Marvel or DC. If the regular issue wasn't ready to ship, um, they had backup issues ready to go. They had, I can't remember what they called them, um, but they had them in a filing cabinet. Like if the Spider-Man issue, if somebody got sick and the artist couldn't draw it, or the writer was behind on the script, or what have you, inventory. That's what they called them, inventory issues. You had one that, and basically literally all you'd need to do was like create a first page and a last page, just like a framing sequence. Like it could be in the middle of Spider-Man having a fight with Mysterio, and then the next part of the Mysterio fight can't happen. So instead, we'll do an issue with Spider-Man fighting Werewolf by Night, and you literally have to just do 2 pages, right? So you get anybody, didn't matter who, wasn't the regular writer, or maybe it was, but it was a different artist because it was already written, and they'd do 1 page where, okay, Mysterio's using his illusion powers on Spider-Man on the first page, and then the whole rest of the issue, except for the last page, would be Spider-Man fighting Werewolf by Night, and the last issue would be him like waking up from that illusion, and the next issue would actually be the second part of the Mysterio that should have been in the previous issue. So even if something happened, because they had these inventory issues stuck in a filing cabinet somewhere to use if they needed to, you didn't have late books. Books weren't pushed. They still came out every month, until Image, and it lost so much momentum, and it created some animosity between retailers and Image as a publisher and their creators, because your invoice would come in from Diamond or Capital City. There was 2 distributors back then, and you would be charged for these Image books that you had ordered, but they wouldn't actually be in your delivery. So you're paying for stock that you don't have and can't sell to recoup the money you just spent on it. I mean, you can imagine how much animosity that created. So I think that had a lot to do with that. I mean, that was a big reason why I fell off, because I stopped paying attention. I think I was still buying it, but then before I knew it, I was like 3 or 4 issues behind. And when you're not reading it on a monthly basis, when it's not coming out on a regular schedule, it just makes it that much easier to jump off. So I think that had a lot to do with why the numbers started dropping. Now, when we're going back and we're reading comics from 30 years ago, we got them all, right? Like, it's going to take us a long time before we get caught up to current issues. So we won't have that, and the fact that they're late and the story losing momentum because of that, we won't have to deal with that at all. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think it definitely contributed to people jumping off of the book, basically.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Rocky?
Uh, I, I remember. I love the '90s. I mean, the early '90s before the big. The funny thing is that I love the years 1992 to 1996. I was actually in law school. I was the most broke I ever was in my life. And yet I always visited the comic shop every Wednesday up in Edmonton, Alberta. I went to University of Alberta, my 3 years of law school. I was broke, but I went to the comic shop, and the retailer always let me read the comics off the shelf. He became a friend of mine, and he allowed me to read the comics without buying them. So I read a lot of comics during that period of time, but did not actually have to buy them, because I befriended the retailer. And so I did read a good number of Spawn that I never did actually buy. And so I always look back on the early '90s sort of fondly, and I always sort of joke that when the bottom hit in '96, when all the bank, the Marvel almost declared bankruptcy, et cetera, I always sort of say, like, I'm glad for like for like the last 30 years, I was so glad I never bought most of the. I read a lot of comics in the 90s, but I never bought them. And I'm so glad because they're worth nothing. But now all
Yep.
of a sudden, especially the Spider-Man and the Spawn, they're starting to go up in value. Now I kind of wish I would have bought them. But I do have 4 copies of Spawn #1 though. I did jump on that bandwagon, and that was a dollar bin comic for like decades, and then all of a sudden now Spawn #1 is worth something. So, and issue 9, first appearance of Angela, which we'll be reviewing as well, is worth something. But it's just funny. I got great memories of reading Spawn and even Youngblood and all that, all those different eclectic artistic styles that certainly aren't my favorite anymore. But it's McFarlane still holds his own. His art's pretty good, and any McFarlane, I think of all the McFarlane and Jim Lee out of that Image crew, I think probably fared better historically into the modern day with their artistic styles. But yeah, great time. Yeah, I continue
Yeah,
to
that's a
enjoy
great.
Spawn. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great conversation to have in terms of the trajectory. Jim eventually sold his empire to DC, and now he's arguably the biggest name at DC. But would he have been better off sticking on his own? Interesting conversation.
Yep.
As far as Spawn #1s, yeah, I think I bought 7 copies. Never sold any of never
You
sold
still
any of
got
them.
him?
So
You still
I still have all 7
awesome.
in a box somewhere. But yeah, and it's funny you talk about reading comics. So I knew somebody that did that at a shop that I went to as well, and he was friends with the owner, and the owner didn't mind.
Mhm.
But I remember the shop that I went to when I think it was. I'm trying to remember. I've gone to so many different shops over the years. I think it was the shop that I went to when I was in college. They had signs hanging from every rack saying this is not a library.
Yeah.
So yeah, they would have
It
they
was
said
to
we're
me.
poor, yeah, poor college students, man. Like, yeah, I think about that now, right? Like I've been thinking, okay, so I bought 7 issues of Spawn #1 at $1.95 a piece, when most comics at that time were, I think, 75 cents or $1, maybe $1.25. It was if it was the deluxe Baxter issues like Noon Teen Titans was, or Legion of Superheroes. Um, but yeah, $2, $1.95. So I bought 7 comics. Comics cost me $14. Oh my god, that's so much money. 14. And now you're like, $14. That'll get you 3 books, maybe
Uh,
3 books
I,
nowadays.
I remember
So
my roommates in we lived in a sort of an old fraternity house. Me and 3 other my law school roommates, and we I remember they would give me shit more than once because they would see a pile of comics, because I would buy some comics, right? But because we were all kind of broke, and we were all budgeted, and they always sort of bugged me because we also had a social life, right? So I mean, $1.99 even back then. I mean, I think it was like $1.75 was the price of a beer, right? I mean, so it's
yeah,
like, I mean, every time I bought a comic, that's one less beer I could drink, and then us buddies, we'd always borrow, we'd always take turn buying drinks, and if I couldn't buy a drink, they'd always give me shit saying they're going to sell my comics on me. And so I said, "You're going to have to find them first, you bastards." But yeah, but
yeah, God, we could yeah. If we start talking about college stuff, we could be here all night. I lived next door to the captain of the hockey team, and there was a bunch of Canadians on our floor and a bunch of the hockey members. And the way I subsidized my comic buying back then was I was the only one on the floor that had a Sega Genesis. Like,
yeah.
that was the system back then, and I had NHL '92, and man, we had epic battles of NHL '92 for $1 a game.
Yeah.
And yeah, I got really good at it. I mean, those guys would kick my ass on the playing real hockey.
Right.
I wasn't on the hockey team, but I knew how to skate. I had my own skate, so they would invite me to the hockey rink. Um, and so it was Berkeley Ice, was because I went to school in San Francisco Bay Area, and it was Berkeley Ice would let the hockey team come and practice for free, but the caveat was practice started at 11 p.m. at night. And so I used to go on Sundays. They would ask other guys to come and kind of play the opposing team so they could actually have a real scrimmage,
Yeah.
because I had my own skates or whatever. And so I would go, and man, they would I would beat them in Sega hockey when it wasn't real, and they would get their revenge and beat the shit out of me on the ice. And I think I got the worst end of that deal. But as what I still have to show for it to this day is I still have a lot of those comics that I bought.
That's
So
right.
the comic shop that I went to was in Concord. It was called the Land of Nevawuz, and it was spelled Nevawuz, like phonetically,
Yeah.
Nevawuz.
Yeah.
And I loved that shop. I loved that shop. And then um, I went back like maybe 15 years after I was out of college. I was in the area. I was like, I'm gonna go buy my old comic. It wasn't there. I was
Mm.
heartbroken. That was such a great shop. That's where I bought Death of Superman and
Yeah.
where I bought a lot of the issues of Spawn, and yeah, all subsidized by my great skills at playing NHL '92, which in retrospect wasn't really fair. It was my Sega Genesis. It was in my dorm room. I got to play and practice like far more than anyone else.
Yeah.
But man, did I talk a lot of shit and then pay for it on Sunday nights in
I know, but it's like
real
saying,
hockey.
I mean, all of us in our university years are, we talk about, we piss all our money away, because we drink and we party too much and everything else. But I got to admit, like, I had a budget for comics and I didn't piss it all away. And a lot of those comics, I mean, they're actually, they have some value now. And those back issues I bought back in the day, especially in 2020, I mean, I got to tell you, like, comic books have shot up in value a lot more than I ever thought they would. So I kind of chuckled because I always wondered, how am I wasting money more, by having a beer or buying a comic book? I'm not really sure, but now I'm thinking, I'm glad I bought that comic and stayed sober that much longer.
Yeah, well, what I think about is, yeah, obviously you think about the mistakes or things you would have done different or whatever. But the older you get, there was a time where I was like, man, the mistakes I made in college or choices I made in college weren't the best. But the older I get, the more I'm glad that I did things the way I did because I have like really fun stories and crazy stories
Yeah.
and good memories, And I
Oh
think
yeah.
now I think if I had it to go back and do it all over again, I would do the same stupid shit because it's just it brings a smile to your face when you think about that stuff.
Yeah.
So fantastic. So anyway, everybody, thanks for joining us on this trip down college memory lane. But no, seriously, everybody, thanks for joining us for another episode of 12 Days of Spawnmas. I'm having a blast doing these. Like I'm enjoying this so much more
Fun.
than I thought I would.
Yeah.
I really did not account for the nostalgia factor and how much these books really stand up. Like I was like, well, I really want to get to the issues of Spawn that I've never read and get caught up to modern day and understand the mythology and whatever. And so I can look at King Spawn and Gunslinger Spawn and Scorch and whatever that's coming out with a more analytical and critical eye with some knowledge. And that was my end goal. But now I'm enjoying it for the comics that we're reading right now in and of themselves. So I'm really glad that we decided to do this. I'm looking forward to next year. I say that now. You might get to me in mid-February and I'll be like, what the fuck was I thinking? To get an episode out every day. Who knows? But for now, I'm really enjoying it. We hope you're all enjoying it too. I will once again remind everybody, as I always do, if you're checking us out just audio only, be sure you head over to YouTube. Watch the episodes there. You can check out the art. You can see Rocky and my smiling faces. Also, be sure you do a search for Comic Space Boom ! That's Rocky's channel on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe. Every subscription, every like on the video really helps us. It expands our reach. The more people that we reach, the more access we get to creators and what have you. And we just did an interview Rocky and I did with one of our favorite creators earlier tonight. That'll be coming out on Friday. I have another interview coming up tomorrow with a really big name creator, so that'll be coming out soon. So again, you can really help us out by subscribing, whether you're subscribing to Rocky's YouTube channel or if you've always watched us on YouTube but you've never taken the time to subscribe to the audio side of things over at the Comic Source, either on your favorite podcast app or your favorite podcast platform, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, iTunes, whatever it is. Again, it just really helps us out. It helps raise our profile. It helps get us more access. So we certainly appreciate the support as always. We hope you guys are enjoying 12 Days of Spawnmas. We definitely are having a lot of fun doing it. So as we're winding up here, I'll once again wish everybody happy holidays, whatever it is that you celebrate, Festivus or Kwanzaa or Hanukkah or Christmas, whatever it is. We hope you're enjoying this holiday season. And we'll definitely be back for issue number 5 tomorrow. And any last thoughts, Rocky?
No, just happy holidays to everyone, and thanks for watching.
Yep. And with that, we will see you all tomorrow.